I'm actually really excited that you're on Courageous Dialogues, and I'll tell you why. Um, when I started my career, it was my second year, because the first year I went to the UK and Italy and Northern
Yep.
Territory and did teaching rounds everywhere. But when I got back to Melbourne, I was working in a school at Lindale, and I actually was looking for new ways of exciting the kids and joined the Are You Mad program.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, 20 years ago. How's that?
There you go.
And so we were the group that ended up going on Channel 31 and working with Deakin to talk about what had gone on in that process with you. So I'm actually quite excited because you kick-started my thinking in terms of, making curriculums exciting and engaging, and to actually really make a difference with, the community that you were in. So I'm loving the fact that you're on right now.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
And so for me, it's been great to see your progression into where you are now. And so
Yes, it's been a long journey.
absolutely it has. So tell me, Courageous Dialogues, tell me a time where you've been courageous.
Oh, look, there are so many times it's ridiculous, but probably too that, and I pointed these out to you previously, is that even leaving the university system after 17 years was really courageous for me, because you being involved in the Are You Mad really stand out of me making a decision at university, going, you know what, I'm not going to make the difference that I want to make by being at university. Because in teaching aerospace engineering at RMIT, I really discovered that I wasn't as passionate about teaching the maths and the engineering and the science that I was involved in. What I was passionate about was the kids learning. And they came into the degrees and they had to have ATAR scores of, on average, 90 and above. Yet they hit university and they struggled. And they struggled because they weren't really great learners. They'd gotten through a system that taught them to pass exams, and there's a right way of doing things. And, if you know what you were looking for, then you would get good marks. And that's not the sort of engineers that would be needed, to solve the problems that, you might face in the aircraft industry or the automotive industry or any sort of engineering. It's all about being a real creative problem solver and critical thinker and working your way through, to solve these sort of problems. And I was like shocked that we didn't teach like that and we didn't develop kids like that. And it's like I did start to shift how I taught. I started to work with students themselves on developing learning materials and them demonstrating stuff. And funnily enough, a lot of things happened longitudinally out of that. So some of them went on to become teachers and are now assistant principals and so on like that. Others founded organizations like Engineers Without Borders, which is now around Australia, and now I interact with on when I'm running my STEM conferences. But leaving that university system after and it was terrifying for me because I'd gotten used to the certainty and the pay coming in, and it was like, well, I wouldn't have that. And then what am I doing next was a real conversation. And back in the early 2000s, we had just bought a house. We had our first child. Our second one was on the way. And it's like, oh my God, like the risk of that.
Well,
and
can
a lot
I
of
just
that
say
came from my
thank
wife
you?
saying, go for it,
Yeah. So thank you for doing that, because you've been provocative in the education space. And tell me what you've done lately in terms of, making people sit up a little bit and think about what they're doing.
I'm the sort of person who has my fingers in a lot of pots at the same time, because when I talk about lots of opportunities to be courageous, I've had to do it every year, where I've had to reinvent myself to meet the needs. So You know, we've been running these STEM conferences in the face of the pandemic is one area that we've been doing, and they're crowdsourced, they're student and teacher conferences, so they're not one or the other. And the idea is to really spark that ecology of STEM and the STEM learning and STEM thinking within the areas. And, you know, in that, because they're crowdsourced, we're bringing together schools, primary and secondary, we're bringing together schools from across sectors, whether they're Catholics or government or independent, universities, industry, all to share and work together and connect as part of that. And, you know, one of the things I'm now starting to get into, which is sort of just in the last week and a half, as I was approached by one of the universities, the University of Tasmania, to actually start measuring the impact of that. And what we're looking at is how do we actually measure the impact of STEM, whether it's our conference or anything. And that's what we're going to be doing as one of the things is, which is, because you look at STEM nationwide, no one knows how to measure it.
Yes, exactly.
You know,
and then it gets even more difficult in terms of year 11 and 12 because no one knows how to actually implement it.
Well, that's right. And in fact, and alongside over the last 2 years of the pandemic, I've been writing a STEM book. Basically, it's about designing an authentic primary school STEM program, but it's built on not about this is what you do. It's about these are the things you need to think about as you plan. Because each school has its own circumstances. So, for example, this morning I was talking to 2 teachers from a special school down in Mornington, and they, you know, they want to implement STEM, but they didn't know where to start. So I'm basically taking them from that sort of design brief. You have to first create a design brief, and this is then the mapping you need to do through to the planning you need to do. And this is all longitudinal sort of stuff that you're not doing straight away. It's done over the year while you're running your STEM program. Because if you're going to grow the capacity of kids, it has to be ritualized. You have to look at the skills you want to build and do it over time. It can't be done with a piecemeal approach.
And that's really important because as you're doing that, as you're running through that program, you're also making the changes for your own context. So, for example, something that I used, you know, at one school might not be working for whatever reason at my other school. And as I'm going through the program, I'm changing what I'm doing because of, you know, your cohort or the setup and all of that. So I think that's really important. People tend to grab a design brief and stick to it and are scared to change it. I'm just like, no, change it to suit your context.
And, you know, and this is the other thing, as your kids start to develop themselves in your school, that will change as well because, you know, if I'm talking primary, like your grade 6 kids, if they've been through your program for 2 or 3 years, then their capacity is far greater than what you originally planned for. And so they're doing amazing things. So, you know, I've seen that with some of the schools that I've worked with is these, you know, at our STEM conference in Melbourne, we had some of the kids from Malvern Valley Primary School come, and I've worked with their teachers to develop their academy program. And they're blowing everybody else out of the water because they're really they've got the design process ingrained. So they know how to empathize, know how to identify the problem, and they work their way through it.
Exactly.
You know, and that's what you need to plan for.
So I'm at a secondary and we started a STEAM program this year.
Yep.
STEM or STEAM, does the A actually belong?
I've had these discussions with a lot of different people, and it's like, I'm like, let's change the question entirely, right? Because the acronym, because then do we include humanities in there? You know, does it STEAM with a H in there? Or do we include design, D-STEAM? You know, you have all these arguments, but I think it misses the point because people use the acronym as a barrier. It's that red herring because it's not about whether it's science, technology, engineering, and maths. It is the thinking frameworks beneath all of that. Because when you dive into the curriculum itself, what you start to see is that the heart of all of the curriculum is particular thinking. So in science, it's the science inquiry skills. In geography, it's the geographical inquiry skills. There's mathematical fluency. There's, in technologies, you've got the design thinking and computational thinking and systems thinking. Those are actually what we're there for. If you focus on those, it doesn't matter what subject you're doing, because then you're able to decompose or deconstruct. You decompose in English, right? You do it in maths, because let's decompose that maths problem to actually understand what it is. What is it asking? What are the critical factors? That's all a design process. So when you start to do those and use the language of those thinking frameworks, it doesn't matter what discipline you're in, any discipline can use it. And in fact, that's one of the things I do in my book, is that here's how these thinking frameworks, the language of those, could be used in multiple different subjects, such that it's a transdisciplinary, cross-curricular sort of thing. And so suddenly any element of the curriculum could deliver that sort of framework of thinking. And then suddenly it's not just about science, technology, engineering, and maths. And, you know, however, what you find is the art subjects, the design subjects, are automatically lend themselves to those.
Absolutely. And I hope people listen to this podcast, because you described that brilliantly. So I guess what follows on from that is the question that gets asked, or, you know, the argument of not running STEM is it takes away from explicit teaching. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
You cannot critically think or problem solve without having some knowledge. And so explicit teaching is a core part of developing the ability for someone to be skilled in something. So you can't be a scientist without having scientific knowledge, or you can't do the inquiry skills with having scientific knowledge, because you would know what to do. The real big challenge or mischief that exists, and I'll talk about two aspects of that. The mischief that exists is it's just explicit teaching and direct instruction. That kills creativity and curiosity in kids, because then it just becomes all about knowledge. Equally, it's not about inquiry learning or problem-based learning, because the kids aren't necessarily skilled in leading their own inquiries or solving problems. So one needs to really have the nuance that it's a building across of skill and knowledge and bringing it together to really challenge their thinking. And there's a great model by Hattie and Donahue, a model of learning, that really unpacks that really well in terms of skill, thrill, and will. And what you start to see when you look at that model is that explicit teaching is critical at the start, but as you're developing skill, so it's a bit like, here you are, you do your explicit teaching, and then you practice and develop skills. So if we use English as an example, so you want them to use, for the sake of a TEAL, you know, to write an essay, topic, evidence, or what is it? Topic. I think it's evidence. There's two E's, right?
Keep going.
And then the acronym of TEAL, right? And then you've got link as your L, right? And the idea is that that's a framework, and that's how you write persuasive arguments, one could say. And the thing about that is that you have to teach them how to do it, but it's the practice that develops their capacity. But as you practice, you start to draw out and work with them about the knowledge that they do and they don't understand around what actually makes evidence. You know, what is a good essay? How do you do good linking sort of stuff? And as you keep to do that, you notice that your year 11, 12 teachers don't use TEAL, but they expect that as a basis because you can actually play around with it. It's just a nice framework at the younger year levels to get them into that mode. So you want them thinking from what it is as a writer. So I don't use TEAL, but I actually now write, and I was never good at English, by the way. It was my worst subject when I was at high school, but I've had to teach myself how to be a good writer as part of it. So explicit teaching is definitely part of it, but it's not the whole kit and caboodle. If we're going to develop creative, problem-solving, independent learners, then we need to be having that sort of nuanced approach across the year levels. And in fact, what I'd tell you is your upper quartile kids, the kids who do the best academically, have learnt that themselves, and they springboard from that base knowledge to do the deeper thinking and the deeper practice such that they can perform.
I've got one more quick one for you because I'm from early childhood, primary and secondary. Yep. Early childhood and primary, you can put in a STEM approach quite easily. When you get to secondary, 7 to 9, usually okay. But when we get into like year 11 and 12, what's your thinking around that?
Look, when I work with schools, I say, if I talk about secondary in this particular case, 7 to 10 is the time that you have. And that's because year 11 and year 12 is delineated by the VCE structure. And so that, because it's so content heavy and so focused on the end result of the exams to get into university, that limits what you can do. But notice that's not necessarily the case in the design subjects, your visual communication, your arts. You find that it's what you produce. You have design portfolios. Now, some schools are starting to move away from that VCE sort of approach, Templestowe High being one of them. But there's a number of schools that's starting that journey and moving away from having to produce VCE results. And universities are starting to acknowledge that. So there's a new program that's coming in into Australia that's called the Universal Learning Program, that was founded by the Swiss school that originated the IBL, the International Baccalaureate, right? And that's a framework for the kids, in essence, creating a learner passport, which demonstrates their knowledge and their skill and their thinking over a long period of time, and using that to get into universities or to whether it's TAFE or apprenticeships or whatever it happens to be. So it's shifting it from these exams through to an entirely different model. And it's a really interesting model because the teachers coaching the students about goal setting, strategies to learn, all those sort of things is at the heart of it. And one of the interesting things that's starting to rise with the schools that I'm working with is this whole world of a whole new relationship between the teachers and the students, because they actually know the individual students and what their challenges are. So you can really target their development. And it's shifting the pedagogy in the classrooms as well. And
that's what's exciting about education. So since I met you 20 years ago, I've been in and out of education. And I'm back in education, have been for the last few years, and it's exciting times because you do have universities starting to think about, what else can we do other than a score, and you do have schools actually starting to think about, especially because of COVID, well, how can we do things differently that actually really matter, that make a difference? So
absolutely.
Yeah. Love chatting to you. Thank you for coming on.
You are welcome.